My dear brothers and sisters, the session is about a paradox. And before I go into what the paradox is, the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. The paradox has been beautifully brought out by the Mother in a prayer dated the 18th of June, 1913. What she says is that why do men flee from these boons as though they feared them? What are the boons she's talking about? The boon of unmixed joy. So, normally in life, joy comes coupled with sorrow, but there is a possibility of experiencing unmixed joy and supreme happiness, peace that is completely unshakable and immutable. These are the boons she's talking about. And she says, why do men run away from them as though they feared them? What, and she goes on to say, what a strange thing is ignorance, that source of all suffering, ignorance of the deeper truths of existence. How miserable that obscurity which keeps men away from the very thing which would bring them happiness and subjects them to this painful school of ordinary existence, fashioned entirely from struggle and suffering. So people tend to stay in that painful school of ordinary existence, a beautiful expression for what life is. And human life seems to have been designed in such a way that it will serve as a school. It teaches us, but it teaches us in a painful manner. And we have a tendency to still go on staying in that school and reject the possibility of that supreme happiness and unmixed joy. So the paradox is that while people are all the time complaining and grumbling about life, they reject the one thing that can give them a life which is full of love, peace, joy, and a sense of fulfillment. And this is the paradox that Sri Aurobindo has explained in Essays on the Gita. In my edition of the book, it is on page 183. Sri Aurobindo says, ask it to rise out of all this disturbance. It, here refers to the human mind. Ask it to rise out of all this disturbance to the unmixed joy of the pure bliss soul, which all the time secretly supports its strength in the struggle and makes its own continued existence possible. It will draw back at once from the call. It does not believe in such an existence, or it believes it would not be life, that would not be at all the varied existence in the world around it, in which it is accustomed to take pleasure. It would be something tasteless and without savour. Or it feels that the effort would be too difficult for it. It recoils from the struggle of the ascent, although in reality, the spiritual change is not at all more difficult than the realization of the dreams the desire soul pursues, nor entails more struggle and labor in the attainment than the tremendous effort which the desire soul expends in its passionate chase after its own transient objects of pleasure and desire. The true cause of its unwillingness is that it is asked to rise above its own atmosphere and breathe a rarer and purer air of life, whose bliss and power it cannot realize and hardly even conceives as real, while the joy of this lower, turbid nature is to it the one thing familiar and palpable. So you would have guessed that the paradox is that there is a possibility of living a spiritual life, which will give us if life in which stress, sorrow, and suffering have no place, and instead life is full of love, peace, joy, and fulfillment. And yet, there's a tendency to run away from this life, fear this type of a life. And Sri Aurobindo has explained this paradox in this passage. Let me go over it slowly. Ask it to rise out of all this disturbance to the unmingled joy of the pure bliss soul, which all the time secretly supports its strength in the struggle and makes its own continued existence possible. It will draw back at once from the call. So there is sometimes a call, a pull, an aspiration felt for the spiritual life, for becoming one with the soul, because we have the divine essence within us, and that can help us unite with the divine. But then the human mind has a tendency to resist that. It will draw back at once from the call that is felt off and on by each one of us, but we rarely respond to it. Ask it to rise out of all this disturbance to the unmingled joy. It here refers to the mind. So ask the mind, the human mind, to rise out of all this disturbance to the unmingled joy of the pure bliss soul. The soul is always in a state of bliss because it has no desires and it has no anger, no jealousy, no hatred. It's full of love and knows what the right thing to do is. So ask it, the human mind, to rise out of all this disturbance, to rise out of this disturbance and go where? To the unmingled joy of the pure bliss soul. And then there's a further description of what this bliss soul does, which all the time secretly supports its strength in the struggle. So, in fact, the struggle in ordinary life is also being supported secretly by the soul. And there is a further sort of elaboration on that is what makes even the continued existence of the soul, that is, this individual soul embodied in this body, in this life, that is possible because the person wants to live. The person has a zest for life, in spite of all the struggle and pain involved. So, in a way, this stressful life, full of struggle and strife, full of pain and suffering, is supported by the soul because otherwise the soul itself will not continue in this body, in this life. It will be because the person will have no zest for life. The person will die and the soul will not continue to exist in this individual, in this body, in this life. So, in a way, one might say that it is in the interest of the soul itself to support whatever type of existence the person is interested in. Even if he is not responding to the call for a higher life, a life which turns up and in rather than down and out, if the person rejects that higher life, still the soul goes on supporting it because, in a way, it is in the interest of the existence of this person, the continued existence of this person in this life. And that is what also leaves open the possibility the person will actually fulfill the purpose of this life. And therefore, the soul supports whatever type of existence the person is interested in. It does not believe in such an existence. It, the human mind, does not believe in such an existence. It does not believe that an existence which has only unmingled joy is possible. Or it believes that it would not be life, that it would not be at all the varied existence in the world around it, in which it is accustomed to take pleasure. It would be something tasteless and without savor. So, Sri Aurobindo has given two reasons, and he'll of course come to a third one, why a person rejects this call, this pull, this aspiration for a spiritual life. Because the human mind does not believe in such an existence. It does not think that an existence which is full of unmingled joy is at all possible. And the other possibility is that it believes that it would not be life. That what would be that monotonous life in which there is no desire, no seeking, no pursuit, no effort, and because there is a certain joy in desire, then seeking to fulfill that desire, making the effort to fulfill that desire, and going through all the struggle and hardship and difficulties that may be involved in the fulfillment of the desire, all that itself gives us a certain amount of happiness. And then we do not mind if it also uh, leads to suffering and sorrow. So that gives a sort of varied existence, happiness coming from effort and uh, the suffering coming from the struggle and the hardships involved. So it becomes a varied existence. So we feel that is life. Life would become so colorless without this type of a variation. So one reason is that the person does not believe that an existence which has only unmingled joy is ever possible. Secondly, even if it is possible, the person rejects it because he thinks that that would not be an interesting life. It will be a monotonous life. The person thinks it would be something tasteless and without savor. And yet, there is also a third reason why the person might reject it: the call to a higher life, to the spiritual life, or it feels that the effort would be too difficult for it. It recoils from the struggle of the ascent, although in reality, so the third reason is that the person thinks that this effort involved in the higher life, in the spiritual life, where one becomes a willing instrument of the divine, that effort would be too difficult for it. The individual thinks that is something which is possible only for a select few. I am not one of them. And therefore, it recoils from the struggle involved in the ascent of consciousness, in rising up, becoming a person better than one already is, person whose life is driven by love rather than the ego. So the person rejects this type of a life because he thinks that the struggle involved is possible only for a select few, and I am not one of them. But then Sri Aurobindo gives the assurance that although in reality the spiritual change is not at all more difficult than the realization of the dreams the desire soul pursues, nor entails more struggle and labor in the attainment than the tremendous effort which the desire soul expends in its passionate chase after its own transient objects of pleasure and desire. So, chasing the ordinary objects of desire, which the person finds interesting, involves no less effort than the effort involved in the higher life, in trying to work towards a higher consciousness. So it's a misunderstanding that the effort will be too much for me. The person is already putting in more effort than that, a tremendous amount of effort in pursuing ordinary worldly desires. And therefore, having a life where much of those desires disappear or at least lose their intensity, that type of a life, he thinks, will be too difficult for me. But it is not more difficult than the life he is already living. So this is a very important passage. Uh, and Sri Aurobindo sort of brings out this paradox very clearly, that the person is willing to go on with the ordinary life, which also involves a lot of struggle and hardship and suffering. And he's willing to put in this effort, but thinks that the effort involved in spiritual life will be even greater than this. I'll not be capable of it, and therefore rejects the spiritual life. Actually, in spiritual life, the effort involved is less than that, certainly not more than that. So, in reality, the spiritual life is about a change for becoming better than we are. So, in reality, the spiritual change is not at all more difficult than the realization of the dreams the desire soul pursues, nor entails more struggle and labor in the attainment than the tremendous effort which the desire soul expends in its passionate chase after its own transient objects of pleasure and desire. So, the person spends a lot of effort pursuing transient objects, objects which will not last, give only pleasure, not joy and delight and bliss. And the person goes on putting in a lot of effort, although with perhaps less effort than that, he'll be able to pursue a spiritual change, a change within, which will reduce the desires, take away their intensity, and make many desires vanish. And the result would be that the person would experience unmingled joy. The true cause of its unwillingness is that it is asked to rise above its own atmosphere. So, why does the person think that that effort will be uh, too much for me? It will be difficult for me to put in the type of effort required in spiritual life, because the person is asked to rise above its own atmosphere and breathe a rarer and purer air of life. So, here Sri Aurobindo is using a very good analogy. You know, if a person is accustomed to living at sea level, where there's a certain amount of atmospheric pressure, and the person is accustomed to breathing air at that atmospheric pressure, if he's told that in the mountains, the it's very pleasant, the scenery is beautiful, there's no pollution, but still the person is afraid of going there because he knows that the atmospheric pressure there will be low. That is what the rarer atmosphere is, and it will be difficult for me to breathe there. Although it is no more difficult to breathe there than in the place at sea level where he is breathing air, no doubt at atmospheric pressure, but which is highly polluted. And he is missing out on that beautiful scenery in the hills and mountains just because of his fear that I will not be able to breathe properly there. So it's this fear of the unfamiliar and the unknown which is discouraging him. So the true cause of its unwillingness is that it is asked to rise above its own atmosphere and breathe a rarer and purer air of life, whose bliss and power it cannot realize and hardly even conceives as real. He doesn't even think that this type of a life can be real. It is possible. He can't imagine that a life which is full of unmixed joy is even possible. While the joy of this lower, turbid nature, that is nature which is fundamentally divine, potentially divine, but all the same mixed with a lot of impurities which have made it turbid, and that is what constitutes ordinary human nature. Uh, the joy of this lower turbid nature is to it the one thing familiar and palpable. So at least this is something familiar, and therefore he's comfortable with it. He has a good feel of it. It's palpable. He has a good feel of this type of a life. He has lived it for a long time, and he thinks that this is what life is about. Any higher life towards which I am feeling a call or a pull is either not possible, or it will not be interesting, or it will require effort which is beyond my capabilities. And because of all this, he thinks that that type of a life is not possible. And even if it is possible, I might have to live in an atmosphere, live a type of life which is going to be very different from this life. And uh, therefore, he rejects it as something uh, because it rejects it as something with which he is not familiar, which is known to him. So it's primarily the fear of the unknown rather than those other three reasons which Sri Aurobindo gave earlier. That is, he thinks that this type of life is not possible, this type of life will not be interesting, this type of life will require the type of effort which I'm not capable of. But in fact, the true reason is that he has fear of the unknown. In fact, the effort required is no more than the effort required in ordinary life, where the person is chasing one desire after another. Of course, it doesn't mean that one has to reject worldly life and go to the Himalayas or to a cave. And that is not what Sri Aurobindo's spirituality is about. It is a highly life affirming, life embracing, life encompassing spirituality. So, spiritual life can be lived while doing the type of person, while doing the type of work that the person is already doing, but then with a different attitude. And that is what makes all the difference. Now, with this, I'll read the passage again and should perhaps make more sense now. Ask it, the human mind. Ask it to rise out of all this disturbance to the unmingled joy of the pure bliss soul, which all the time secretly supports its strength in the struggle and makes its own continued existence possible. It will draw back at once from the call. It, throughout refers uh, to the human mind. It does not believe in such an existence, or it believes that it would not be life, that it would not be at all the varied existence in the world around it, in which it is accustomed to take pleasure. It would be something tasteless and without savor. Or it feels that the effort would be too difficult for it. It recoils from the struggle of the ascent, although in reality, the spiritual change is not at all more difficult than the realization of the dreams that desire soul pursues, nor entails more struggle and labor in the attainment than the tremendous effort which the desire soul expends in its passionate chase after its own transient objects of pleasure and desire. The true cause of its unwillingness is that it is asked to rise above its own atmosphere and breathe a rarer and purer air of life, whose bliss and power it cannot realize and hardly even conceives as real, while the joy of this lower, turbid nature is to it the one thing familiar and palpable. So it is basically the fear of the unknown that makes us reject that call for a higher life. This passage, in fact, to some extent, I have torn out of context. although it gives a message in itself. And if you want to know where it is from the first series of essays in the Essays on the Gita, chapter 19, which is titled Equality. Now, equality is quite similar to equanimity, but goes beyond equanimity. So, how it goes beyond equanimity and what the context of this passage is in this chapter on equality, that we can leave for another occasion, or you may turn to the book itself and read it for yourself. It is Series 1, Chapter 19 in Essays on the Gita by Sri Aurobindo. And the book is available for free download on the website of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Pondicherry. Thank you.